For decades, the names of Fangio, Prost, Senna and Schumacher have dominated discussions of Formula One's greatest drivers. But there's a name consistently left out of that conversation: Jack Brabham. A three-time world champion, a brilliant strategist, and a supremely talented driver, Jack Brabham deserves far greater recognition. So let's trace the journey of the mechanic from Sydney, who not only raced with the best, but beat them using machines he built himself. This is the story of Jack Brabham, innovator, champion, and arguably one of the most underestimated drivers in Formula One history. Born in 1926 in Hurstville, Sydney, Jack Brabham's early fascination with mechanics led him to a wartime apprenticeship with the Royal Australian Air Force. After the war, he opened his own workshop and built and raced midget cars on dirt tracks, quickly gaining a reputation for technical genius and daring skill, and winning titles from his very first season. In 1955, he was persuaded to consider a racing career in Europe by Dean Delamont, competitions manager of the RAC, who had seen him perform at the New Zealand Grand Prix. Encouraged by friend Ron Taranach and boosted by a record of national success, Brabham sailed to the UK, armed with a toolbox and an unshakable belief in engineering-driven racing. At the 1955 British Grand Prix at Aintree, he made his Formula One debut in a Cooper Bristol which he had built himself, and was back a year later with an ageing Maserati 250F. Neither entry was to result in a race finish, although third place in a non-championship race at Snetterton was enough to convince him that he had the talent to make it in Europe. In 1957, Brabham signed to drive for Cooper, although the agreement included being a part-time mechanic, transporter driver, and many other odd jobs too. In Monaco, Brabham's first appearance of the season, he posted a lap fast enough to get the car onto the grid before promptly wrecking it after the brakes failed on him. Brabham took over the Formula 2 car Les Leston had been driving, and overnight swapped the Formula 1 engine from one car to the other. On race day, from 13th on the grid, Brabham took the nimble Cooper into third place and was looking good for a remarkable podium finish when the engine cut out going through the tunnel on the final lap, a result of the fuel pump shearing off. The car rolled as far as the Tabac corner, and from there a fired-up Brabham jumped out and pushed it the last half mile to the checkered flag, salvaging 6th place, albeit without reward, as points were only awarded to the first 5 finishers at the time. 4 more races followed, with the team's final entry being the Pescara Grand Prix, a 17-mile course on roads in the Italian Adriatic Riviera to rival the Nürburgring, with 2 massive straights which completely negated the Cooper's handling advantage and accentuated its lack of power. Nevertheless, Brabham was running well, and as faster cars dropped out and Brabham's push-on driving style through the twisty road section got him past others, he entered the final lap in 5th place, on course to achieve another remarkable result. Again, the car spluttered and coughed, and then the engine died, out of fuel once more. As the car rolled to a halt, Brabham spotted a roadside petrol station behind the massed spectators. He rolled the Cooper onto the forecourt and persuaded the attendant to add some fuel. Once topped up, he fired the Cooper up and raced to the finish line, finishing 7th. In 1958, Brabham's season started in Monaco, where he qualified on the front row of the grid. At the start, Jean Behra led away, with Brabham slotting into 2nd place. However, a rear suspension problem required a lengthy pit stop to resolve. Even so, Brabham was able to work his way back into 4th place and score his best Formula 1 result to date. More finishes, but no more points followed for the rest of the season, as the power deficit of the small Climax engine proved too much of a handicap to overcome. For 1959, therefore, Climax enlarged their engine to 2.5 litres, providing much needed additional horsepower. Brabham took his first ever Formula One victory at Silverstone in the International Trophy non-championship race. And then came Monaco and his first victory in a World Championship Grand Prix. Having qualified third, Brabham chased Stirling Moss for the first 80 laps, before claiming the lead. What should have then been an easy victory was made trickier because of heat soak from the front radiator, which was making the car's pedals red hot. Brabham's driving shoes were sizzling from the heat, and he was finding it increasingly difficult to brake and accelerate. To add to his problems, the Ferrari of Tony Brooks was closing fast, but not fast enough, and Brabham held on to win his first Grand Prix by 20 seconds. Next time out in Holland, Brabham should have claimed victory again. However, he lost use of second gear, vital on the Zandvoort circuit, and had to settle for second place behind Joe Bonnier. From there to Reims, where the French Grand Prix was a victim of incredible heat, which caused lumps of asphalt to be torn from the road surface and thrown into the path of following cars. Brabham once more had to suffer the pain of red-hot pedals, and was grateful to claim third place behind the Ferraris at the checkered flag. At the British Grand Prix, Brabham overcame Moss in a perfect example of the adaptability of the Australian driver. The Aintree circuit was hard on tyres, and Cooper was unable to secure a supply of the bigger Dunlops needed. From pole position, Brabham started on 3 Grand Prix tyres, with a heavier treaded sports car tyre on the left front wheel, which suffered the most wear around the Aintree circuit. Brabham led from the start, but Moss was close behind. By half distance, the tread of the left front tyre was almost gone. A pit stop would have been a disaster. The Cooper was using 5-stud wheels, as opposed to the centre-lock nut on Moss's BRM. If both stopped to change tyres, Brabham would lose a minute to Moss. Unable to countenance a pit stop, Brabham changed his driving style. Rather than driving through the right-hand corners, he arrived at them almost sideways and drifted the car around on full opposite lock. By doing so, he reduced the load on the left front tyre, and whilst Moss had to pit to fit new Dunlops, Brabham was able to cruise to the end of the race and claim his second victory of the season. The following Grand Prix was at Avis, perhaps the strangest track used for a European Grand Prix. Cars blasted down the autobahn between 2 junctions, looping back around the top junction banking and the lower junction's roundabout. Before the race, French Grand Prix legend Jean Bera had been killed in a sports car supporting event when his Porsche had come off at the top of the banked curve. And in the race, Hans Hermann was to have a lucky escape when his BRM lost its brakes approaching the slower corner and was sent flying into the air, somersaulting several times. Hermann was thrown out and incredibly walked away. Meanwhile, Brabham retired with gearbox problems. At Monsanto Park in Lisbon, Brabham was to have his own personal horror show weekend. Losing his wallet to a pickpocket and a toenail to a canoe in the days before the race. Then, on race day, he was wiped out by an inattentive backmarker, the collision sending the Cooper into its own series of barrel rolls after collecting a telegraph pole. Brabham was thrown from the car and was narrowly missed by teammate Maston Gregory, who arrived on the scene as Brabham was tumbling down the track minus his car. The bad run wasn't even over then. Brabham had to endure a ride to the local hospital at the hands of the craziest ambulance driver in all of Portugal. Once there, he was found to be remarkably uninjured. At Monza for the penultimate race, Brabham claimed third place behind Moss and Phil Hill, which left the title wide open coming into the season decider at Sebring. Brabham led with 31 points, whilst Moss had 25.5 and Brooks 23. With only the season's best 5 results counting, and a point for fastest lap on offer, there were numerous permutations for the final standings. A win for Brabham sealed the title. If Moss won and Brabham was second, the title would go to Moss unless Brabham scored the fastest lap. A win for Brooks would clinch the title as long as neither Brabham or Moss claimed second place. Brabham nearly never made it to the race, after a pebble smashed the lens of his goggles when he was driving at Nassau Speed Week, leaving him with glass in his eye. The shards were carefully removed and Brabham was able to travel to Sebring in time for first practice. But things didn't improve much when he got there. He slid off the track on spilt oil, damaging the car's radiator and cooking its engine. He swapped cars with teammate Bruce McLaren and found that the new car had a twisted chassis and a damaged gearbox. Overnight, the team, including Brabham and McLaren, worked on the two cars in order to be in a position to start the race. The front row of the grid was Moss, Brabham, and American Harry Schell, who had been promoted as a result of some decidedly dodgy timekeeping. Brooks was dropped to the second row as a result. At the start, Moss romped away, but Brabham didn't believe the Rob Walker Cooper could survive the pace Moss was running, and sure enough, on the sixth lap its gearbox failed, handing Brabham the lead. The title battle was down to 2 now, but Brooks had been hit by teammate Taffy von Trips on the first lap, which had required a lengthy pit stop, dropping him down the order and apparently out of the title battle. Brabham led, with McLaren behind playing wingman. Maurice Trontignan was third, but gradually closing. On the last lap, and it always was on the last lap with Brabham, his Cooper coughed and spluttered, once more running out of fuel. As Brabham slowed, so too did McLaren, not realising what was happening, and only Brabham's frantic gesturing made him realise that he needed to go past and win the race. The Kiwi held off the closing Trontignan by half a second to win the race and become the youngest race winner in Formula One history. Brabham was once more out of his car and pushing, perhaps not realising that the championship was now secured. He pushed the Cooper 400 yards, all of it uphill, to claim a fourth-place finish behind Brooks. Brabham was the first Australian world champion, and Cooper had secured the constructors' title, the first for a mid-engined car. For 1960, Cooper and Brabham received an early shock when the new mid-engined Lotus 18 arrived and left them standing in the first race in Argentina. McLaren would claim victory for Cooper after the Lotuses failed, but Brabham and McLaren, seeing the writing on the wall, persuaded John Cooper that a new car was needed. The two drivers drew up plans for a new car with a much stiffer chassis, coil springs and a new gearbox, designed by the team's chief designer, Owen Maddock. Moss won the Monaco Grand Prix, but Brabham responded by claiming victory in Holland, leading from the start. The following race was Belgium, and it was to be one of those black weekends which Formula One suffers. Firstly, during practice, Stirling Moss was badly injured after his Lotus lost a wheel at the very fast Burnhamville corner. Then, Michael Taylor's privately entered Lotus had a steering failure which sent it straight into the woods, destroying the car and leaving its driver paralysed. On race day, whilst Brabham and McLaren ran away with the race to claim a comfortable 1-2 victory, 2 British drivers were to lose their lives within 5 laps of each other. First, on lap 20, Chris Bristow spun his Lotus into trackside fencing and was decapitated. Then, on lap 25, Alan Stacey was hit in the face by a bird, causing him to crash at high speed. He was thrown from his car and killed instantly. Brabham took his 3rd consecutive win in France after a race-long battle with Phil Hill's Ferrari, and followed that up with victory at Silverstone after a battle with the other racing Hill, Graham. Finally, Brabham took his 5th consecutive victory in Portugal, despite an early spin on the Oporto tramlines. Yes, really. And clinched his and Cooper's 2nd titles. For 1961, Formula One adopted new 1.5 litre engine rules, whilst also increasing the minimum weight of the cars. The rules seemed to be a deliberate attempt to slow Cooper and Lotus and allow Ferrari to catch up. The season was a forgettable one for Brabham and for Cooper, but the two were going their separate ways at the end of the season, with Brabham entering his own team in Formula One from 1962. Ron Tauranac had arrived from Australia, and together the two friends had formed a company to produce and sell racing cars, Motor Racing Developments. During 1961, the pair had been developing a Formula Junior car, And as soon as Brabham was free of his Cooper commitment, work began on preparing a Formula One car for the 1962 season. Whilst that car was being developed, Brabham would drive a customer Lotus 24. The Lotus was still competitive, even though it was no match for either the revolutionary Lotus 25 in Jim Clark's hands or the BRM in Graham Hill's. Brabham picked up a couple of points finishes at Spa and Aintree. But then, for the second half of the season, the all-new Brabham BT3 was ready and made its debut at the Nürburgring, where it retired after engine problems, albeit having shown an impressive turn of pace. In the car's second outing at Watkins Glen for the United States Grand Prix, Brabham qualified fifth and then raced home to a fourth-place finish despite gear selection problems, scoring the first points for the new team and becoming the first person to score points in a car he had designed and built. For the season finale in South Africa, he repeated the feat, ending the season on a high. In 1963, the team introduced the BT7 and a second entry for American Dan Gurney. The season was beset with problems, but Gurney was still able to claim the team's first podium by finishing third in the rain at Spa, and both drivers were to claim second-place finishes. As a result, and despite the car's unreliability, the Brabham team claimed third place in the Constructors' Championship. Brabham was even able to claim victory at the non-championship Solitude Grand Prix in Germany after Clark's Lotus failed. At the beginning of 1964, Brabham would win again in the Aintree 200 and Silverstone non-championship races, and it was clear that the BT7 was a competitive proposition when it was running. Both cars retired from the opening races in Monaco and Holland, but in Belgium things looked like they were turning round. Gurney claimed pole and was running away with the race when, with just 3 laps remaining, his car started to run out of fuel. He pitted at the end of the lap. However, the team wasn't ready to refuel the car, and he left the pits planning to stop next time around. The car only made it as far as Stavelot before rolling to a halt with its tank empty. Brabham himself came home in third place, but it was poor reward for what should have been his first win as a constructor. The wait for that first win wasn't too much longer though, as Gurney claimed victory in the next race in France, after hounding Clark's Lotus around the road circuit of Rouen, before winning out when Clark's engine failed. Brabham lost out to Hill in an epic battle for second place, but the joy was unconfined. Brabham was now a Grand Prix winner as a driver and a constructor. The remainder of the season was mostly a disappointment for Brabham the driver and Brabham the constructor, although it ended in another victory for Gurney in Mexico. Gurney's victory was some measure of compensation for a number of good results which both drivers had been robbed of by the poor reliability of the Climax engine Brabham were using. 1964 was not all about Formula One though. In May, Brabham qualified for the Indy 500, but because he failed to run in the early qualifying sessions, was forced to start towards the back of the grid. This was a bad place to be, as he would be running behind Dave McDonald in the Thompson Special. That car had been tested by Graham Hill, who refused to drive it because he thought it was dangerous. Brabham's friend and former Cooper teammate Maston Gregory had been slated to drive the second car, but after a crash in practice, refused to get back into it. Gregory warned Brabham that the car was an accident waiting to happen, especially on full tanks, and as a result, Brabham was keeping a close eye on McDonald as the race started. The accident Gregory had foretold came on the second lap, when McDonald lost control low on the apron of turn 4, hit the inside wall at speed, which caused the fuel in the car's tanks to explode into a massive fireball. The burning wreck came back across the track, blinding those behind. Eddie Sachs tried to go through a closing gap on the right of the track, but instead hit the wreck at high speed. Sachs was killed instantly in the impact, whilst his car too burst into flames. Brabham, forewarned by Gregory, had been hard on the brakes and managed to dodge around the wrecked cars safely. Others weren't so lucky and were caught up in the accident, fortunately without serious injury. McDonald passed away that night as a result of the damage to his lungs from the fire, and Brabham would not return to Indianapolis for many years after. For 1965, Brabham were now running the new BT11 and, for the first time, were planning to run 3 cars, with Kiwi Denny Hulme stepping up from Formula 2 for selected races. The year would not produce a victory, but Gurney finished each of the last 5 races on the podium, whilst Brabham and Hulme picked up several good points finishes. Brabham also stood down as a driver in several races, taking up the role of team manager as Hulme and Giancarlo Baghetti had races for the team. For 1966, Formula 1 would abandon the 1.5 litre engines for new 3 litre units. Climax would not be building engines for the new formula, so Brabham had to find a replacement for the engines which had been the cause of so many of the team's problems. A new Repco V8, built in Melbourne using Oldsmobile alloy engine blocks, would power the car. Neither of the new cars would finish at Monaco, but at Spa, Brabham would claim 4th place and the team's first points of the season after surviving a huge moment at Bournonville on the first lap, after a sudden rain shower caused chaos. In France, Brabham took victory after Bandini's Ferrari dropped out. The victory was notable because it was the first time a race had been won with the driver and constructor being the same man. It was a momentous occasion, and at Brands Hatch there was another, as Brabham led Hulme over the line to clinch the team's first ever 1-2 finish. At Zandvoort, Brabham saw off Clark's Lotus to claim a 3rd win in a row, and when he followed that with victory in the rain at the Nürburgring, the championship was all but assured. In Italy, Brabham retired with engine troubles. However, when Surtees and Stewart retired and Rindt could only manage 4th place, the championship was confirmed, and at the next race Brabham sealed the constructors' title as well, after Ferrari failed to score. 1966 was a personal triumph for Brabham. He had won his 3rd World Championship, something only achieved previously by Fangio, and only bettered by Fangio. He had become the first person to win a race driving a car he had built, the first person to win a drivers' championship in a car he had built, and he had beaten the likes of Ferrari, Lotus and Cooper to win the Constructors' Championship. For 1967, Brabham's season started well. Both drivers scored points at the season opener in Kyalami, and then Hulme scored his first Grand Prix victory at Monaco, in a race marred by Lorenzo Bandini's fatal accident. The team were to score 3 1-2 finishes, with Brabham winning in France and Canada, Hulme in Germany, and when Clark could only finish in 3rd place in Italy, it meant the championship battle was between the 2 Brabham teammates. At Watkins Glen, Brabham suffered a puncture, which meant that he could only finish 5th, whilst Hulme coasted across the line out of fuel to take 3rd place, leaving the Kiwi 5 points ahead going into the championship decider in Mexico. Brabham could only take the title if he won the race, and even then he would need Hulme to finish 5th or lower. Neither Brabham driver could do anything about Clark's Lotus on race day, and Hulme followed Brabham across the line in 2nd and 3rd places to become the only New Zealander to win the World Championship. Brabham retained the Constructors' title, and for the 2nd time in its short existence, the team had cleaned up. In 1968, Hulme left Brabham to join Bruce McLaren's All-Kiwi team, and Brabham replaced him with Jochen Rindt, who had impressed him so much with his Formula 2 drives and his handling of the cumbersome Cooper the previous season. Also undergoing change was the Repco V8 engine. At the tail end of 1967, the Ford Cosworth in the back of the Lotus 49 had proved itself to be a game changer, and to avoid being left behind, Repco looked at a number of radical solutions to bridge the performance gap, before settling on a quad-cam version of the V8, which abandoned the simplicity of its predecessor, and with it went reliability too. Brabham only reached the finish line once all season, whilst Rindt only got there twice, scoring podiums on both occasions. Rindt excelled in the car when it was running, whilst Brabham was more and more sidetracked with the engineering side of things, notably at Zandvoort, where he was forced to lift the cylinder heads from the 2 engines and carve chunks out of the pistons to stop a catastrophic collision between piston and valves, destroying the engines completely, For 1969, Brabham joined the queue for Cosworth DFVs, admitting that the Repco relationship was broken. The 12,000-mile distance between team and engine supplier was just too big of an obstacle to overcome. With the DFVs came a new sponsor in Gulf Oil and their preferred driver, Jackie Ickx. The Belgian replaced Rindt, who had been tempted away to Lotus by the promise of the Lotus 49 and a big money contract. The new BT26 Cosworth DFV combination started well, with Brabham beating Rindt to pole position for the first race in South Africa. But in the race, both Brabham cars suffered wing failures. The team scored points regularly in the early part of the season, but after Zandvoort, Brabham suffered a huge accident during a Goodyear tyre test at Silverstone. A front tyre failed going through Club Corner, and Brabham had crashed heavily and was left trapped in the car, with fuel leaking and the engine running flat out. A dazed but conscious Brabham was able to bend the damaged bodywork sufficiently to hit the engine kill switch, but was unable to extract himself, and there were no marshals to assist. Eventually the team's mechanics arrived, and Ron Dennis, the team's senior mechanic, guided rescue operations. Brabham's left ankle was badly broken, and he would miss the next 3 races whilst it healed. Whilst he was away, Ickx started to deliver on his promise, taking 3rd place in France, 2nd in Britain, and then his first victory for Brabham in a dominant performance at the Nürburgring. He would win again in Canada, with Brabham taking 2nd place. By then, though, the championship was over. Stewart had won 5 races in the first half of the season and had wrapped up the title with 2nd place in Germany. That victory in Canada, along with a 2nd place finish in the finale at Mexico, meant that Ickx would finish as championship runner-up. Brabham finished the season with a couple of podiums, but for both team and driver it had been a disappointing year. Brabham had decided to retire from Formula 1 at the end of the season, and had an agreement with Jochen Rindt for the Austrian to return to the team after an unhappy year at Lotus. Then, Colin Chapman made Rindt a financial offer which Brabham couldn't match, so Brabham reluctantly allowed Rindt to break their agreement and stay with Lotus. Jack Brabham would drive for 1 more season. Brabham designer Ron Tauranac had bucked the trend for monocoque chassis first set by the Lotus 25. Primarily this was because the cost of repair was a concern to the tightly funded team. Brabham argued that if one of his tubular framed cars got damaged, he could cut out the damaged section and weld in new tubes, whereas a monocoque was effectively scrapped once damaged. For 1970 though, Tauranac produced his first monocoque Formula 1 car, driven by new safety regulations which made one almost mandatory. Brabham was pleased with the new car from the very first shakedown test. Ickx had returned to Ferrari, and he was replaced as the team's 2nd driver by Rolf Stommelen. At the first race in South Africa, Brabham roared to victory, despite being pushed off the road by Rindt at the first corner. He fought his way past Stewart's Matra to claim the 14th and final win of his career. He would have probably followed that up with a win in Spain in the next race, but a faulty crankshaft failed in the DFV engine, ending his race. At Monaco, Brabham managed to throw away victory on the very last corner of the very last lap, making an uncharacteristic error at the gasworks hairpin. Brabham had been well ahead of Chris Amon, with Rindt bottled up behind him. When the Kiwi suspension failed, it released Rindt, who was 9 seconds behind with 18 laps to run. Despite Rindt's speed, Brabham was comfortably on his way to victory, until he was held up by backmarkers, allowing Rindt to close to within a second at the start of the last lap. Brabham was then undone by another backmarker at the final corner, missing his braking point and sliding into the straw bales on the outside of the hairpin. Rindt slipped through to claim the victory, whilst Brabham rejoined and took 2nd place. After the Monaco race, Bruce McLaren was killed in a testing accident at Goodwood. And then, between the Belgian and Dutch Grand Prix, Brabham was to have another near miss in testing at Zandvoort. A rear tyre failure sent the Brabham off the road and into the dunes, where it rolled several times through wire catch fencing. Brabham was hanging upside down, trapped in the car, because the fencing had wrapped itself around the cockpit. Fuel was leaking from the nearly full tanks, and although he was able to kill the engine, there were plenty of hot surfaces which could ignite the leaking fuel. Fortunately, spectators arrived and were able to clear a space in the wires for Brabham to exit. The next weekend at the Dutch Grand Prix, Brabham was behind Pierce Courage when the Englishman fatally crashed in a similar manner to Brabham's testing accident. Having lost two friends in the space of a few weeks, Brabham came under increasing pressure from his family to retire immediately rather than carry on until the end of the season. But still having a shot at the title, Brabham stuck to his original decision. He finished third in France, and then lost another certain victory at Brands Hatch when his car ran out of fuel 2 corners from the finish line. As the Brabham rolled up to the checkered flag with its engine dead, Rindt sped past to claim his third consecutive victory. Brabham discovered that the fuel injection had been left at full rich rather than being set back to normal on the grid, and as a result it used more fuel than it should have done, costing Brabham the race. For many years Brabham incorrectly blamed Ron Dennis for this mistake. Brabham was left with a 12-point deficit to recover in the second half of the season, but that increased to a near insurmountable 21 when Rindt won at the Nürburgring, whilst Brabham retired on the first lap. Brabham failed to score points at all during the second half of the season, whilst Rindt won the championship posthumously after being killed in practice for the Italian Grand Prix. This was all the more upsetting for Brabham, as he believed that if he had forced Rindt to honour their agreement for 1970, the Austrian would not have been killed and would have probably won the championship anyway. Brabham's final race would be in Mexico, where he was running in third behind the two Ferraris when his engine failed with 13 laps to go, bringing the curtain down on an illustrious career in the manner which many of his previous races had ended. Brabham passed control of the Brabham team to Ron Taranach after his retirement, who then sold it to Bernie Ecclestone. Brabham and his family returned to Australia, moving to a farm outside Melbourne, as Brabham's wife sought to keep their sons away from racing, unsuccessfully as it turned out. Brabham hated the farm, and became more and more convinced that he had retired from Formula One too early. Brabham's legacy in motorsport goes far beyond what he achieved on the track. The Brabham team went on to win 2 Drivers' World Championships with Nelson Piquet in 1981 and 1983. Ron Dennis started his own Project 4 racing team, which eventually took over McLaren and became one of the most successful operations in Formula One history. Ron Taranach's Ralt Formula 2 and Formula 3000 team achieved great success in the 80s, whilst John Judd, Brabham's engineer on the Climax and Repco engines, started his own engine company and became a supplier of engines to Formula One during the late 80s. When considering the greatest Formula One drivers of all time, Jack Brabham is often overlooked. It is forgotten how he won 3 world championships in a remarkably challenging period. He should be remembered not just as a champion, but as the architect of modern Formula One. He proved that the racetrack rewards not just speed, but intellect, invention, and resilience. His story is a blueprint for grit over glamour, substance over style. And if greatness is defined not by what you inherit, but by what you build, then few built more than Jack Brabham. His achievements deserve recognition alongside those of the sport's most celebrated figures. He was a truly exceptional driver, a brilliant engineer and businessman, and a pioneer of Formula One.